I don't think that we can ever have peace with my family unless the truth is out there.
What if your entire identity was built on a lie? What if your bloodline, your legacy, wasn't what the world believed it to be? Prince Harry spent his life under royal rules. But when DNA tests surfaced, they didn't just confirm whispers, they confirmed something that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. What the results revealed made Harry question everything, and what he did do next, no one saw coming. Let's go back to where the questions first began, with the boy born into a kingdom, but never truly feeling like he belonged. From the moment he was born, Harry didn't quite look like the rest of them. In a world where the image was everything, where bloodlines were guarded like national treasures, and tradition ran thicker than truth, Harry arrived like a flame in a palace of shadows. He was the second son of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, at least. That was what the world was told. Born in 1984, he was cradled in royal arms and swaddled in expectations. But even as an infant, something about him stirred curiosity. It wasn't just the title. It wasn't just the crown waiting for 3 seats down the line. It was his hair, bright, unmistakably red, a jarring splash of color against the muted browns and soft golds of the Windsor lineage. The world saw it. The media fixated on it. That fiery mop of hair, paired with a face full of freckles and an infectious smile, became a symbol of innocence and defiance. People adored him, the cheeky one, they called him. But beneath the adoration was a quiet undercurrent of confusion. Charles had no red hair, neither did William. Their complexions matched, and their features aligned. But Harry looked like he'd stepped out of a different story entirely. The resemblance to his mother's side was undeniable. Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, had that same coppery hue in his youth, that same mischievous glint in his eye. Richard Dalton, Diana's trusted hairdresser and confidant, once remarked that Harry's striking red hair was a Spencer trait through and through, passed down like a family heirloom. Not a royal one, but the hair was just hair, or so they said. Yet whispers started forming in drawing rooms and behind closed doors. People pointed at the contrast, at the difference, at the way he stood out even among his kin. And while many wrote it off as a charming quirk, a boy who bore his mother's beauty rather than his father's legacy, others weren't so quick to dismiss it. Because when the House of Windsor is involved, nothing is ever just a coincidence. And Harry's hair? It became more than a color. It became a question that would echo for decades, morphing from innocent curiosity into dangerous speculation. It was the red thread that began to unravel something deeper. Because in the royal world, appearances aren't just appearances, they're evidence. And for those who looked close enough, Harry's presence hinted at something no title could protect, something no crown could silence. But the red hair was only the beginning soon. Questions about Harry's true father would start making global headlines. And once those whispers took root, they would never let go. A writing instructor, a secret romance, a child with familiar features. The whispers began softly, carried on the backs of tabloids and hushed palace murmurs, but they soon swelled into a storm that would shadow the House of Windsor for decades. In 1986, 2 years after the birth of Prince Harry, Diana, Princess of Wales, crossed paths with a man who would ignite one of the most explosive royal rumors of all time, James Hewitt. He wasn't a politician, a noble, or a man of status. He was her writing instructor. But in a world defined by appearances, protocol, and bloodlines, it was their connection that drew the most attention. What began as a professional arrangement between a royal princess and a former cavalry officer evolved into something the world would dissect for years, a romance that offered Diana solace, and unknowingly lit a match beneath the foundation of the monarchy. At the time, Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was already fraying behind palace walls. Public smiles concealed private betrayals. She was adored by the public but isolated in her own home, desperately searching for something real. In Hewitt, she found it. The two shared a love for horses, but that was only the beginning. Over the next 5 years, their bond deepened. Diana would later confess to the affair, acknowledging the comfort he provided when her world felt cold. And though their relationship began after Harry's birth, a timeline confirmed by multiple insiders, it didn't stop the rumors from snowballing. Because love wasn't the only thing Diana and Hewitt seemed to share. There was something else, something uncanny. Photos of Hewitt and young Prince Harry were laid side by side. Both had fiery red hair, fair skin, and that same sharp profile. They both rode horses, played polo, and even shared a boyish charm that made comparisons irresistible. It was a coincidence, they said, a genetic trick of fate. But the public wasn't so sure. The narrative was too compelling, too perfect. And the more the royals denied it, the louder the questions became. The media seized it with ruthless energy, spreading stories that Diana and Hewitt may have met before 1986. What if the timeline was wrong? What if the palace had buried the truth? It was a theory that grew legs and wings. Despite every official assertion, despite every insider swearing by dates and events, doubt refused to die. It clung to Harry like a shadow, following him into adulthood, into marriage, into exile. The resemblance to Hewitt wasn't just skin deep, critics argued. It was the way they walked, the way they laughed, the way they carried themselves with a mix of charm and rebellion. Even as facts were laid bare, appearances whispered a different story, one that logic couldn't quite silence, because sometimes what people see becomes more powerful than what they know. And in this case, what they thought they saw was a son who didn't quite fit the mold, and a man whose affair with a princess had consequences no one dared to speak aloud. Still, appearances could deceive, but what about behavior, personality, and even posture? Sometimes it's not what you see, it's what doesn't match that tells the story. For years, Prince Harry's appearance was dismissed as nothing more than a genetic quirk, a charming nod to his mother's side. But as he grew older, the whispers sharpened, the questions multiplied, and what once seemed like harmless speculation began to feel like a reckoning. Because when you're born into a dynasty where every feature is scrutinized and every resemblance measured against royal expectations, even the smallest deviation becomes impossible to ignore. Harry's red hair had always drawn comparisons to the Spencer family, but it was his build, his bearing, and the way he moved through the world, those were the details that began to unnerve the watchers of the crown. He stood differently. His posture was looser, his stance more grounded, unburdened by the stiffness of royal tradition. His smile came easier, his laugh more boyish, less restrained. He was athletic, yes, but not in the reserved way of Charles. He had a spark, a swagger. That didn't come from Buckingham. And then came the comparisons, unofficial of course, but relentless. Polo photos surfaced, not the glossy ones curated for the public, but the candid shots, the mid-match moments. They showed a man in his 20s, face flushed with effort, hair tousled, grinning as he raised a mallet. And next to them, older pictures of James Hewitt in his prime, also on the field, wearing the same grin, the same build, the same unmistakable energy. It wasn't just hair anymore. It was motion, mannerism, mirror images playing the same game a generation apart. Even royal insiders couldn't ignore it. Former Royal Protection Officer Ken Worf, one of the few who had access to Diana's private world, stood firm on the record. Diana didn't meet Hewitt until after Harry was born. The timeline, he said, was clear, irrefutable. And yet the photographs said something else. As Harry aged, his face matured into something that didn't sit comfortably within the Windsor mold. The soft angles of youth sharpened into a structure that bore little resemblance to Charles. His voice, his gait, and the way he turned his head during interviews all seemed to trace back to someone who wasn't supposed to be part of the royal equation. Each passing year seemed to push Harry further from his supposed roots and closer to the man whose name never quite left the headlines. And that's where the contradiction dug in its claws. If the timeline was so clean, if the truth was so obvious, why did the comparisons only grow stronger? Why did so many people feel they were watching a ghost of Hewitt rise through the ranks of royalty? There were no official answers, only more questions. The palace stuck to its story. The media fed on the tension, and Harry, stuck in the middle, grew into a man who couldn't quite fit the frame he'd been born into. Because appearances weren't lying. They were speaking, loudly. And even with all the public denial, whispers grew louder. Could DNA testing finally silence them? In 2003, DNA samples were taken, but the truth still refused to surface. It had been nearly 2 decades since Prince Harry's birth, yet the question of his paternity still clung to the royal family like a shadow they couldn't shake. The whispers, once confined to tabloids and hushed drawing rooms, had grown louder, more persistent. And so, one of Britain's most controversial newspapers, News of the World, claimed to take matters into their own hands. In a shocking and unauthorized move, they announced that they had obtained strands of Prince Harry's hair. The goal? A paternity test that would finally silence the speculation once and for all. But instead of providing closure, the results only deepened the divide between truth and belief. The report boldly claimed that the test ruled out James Hewitt as the biological father. On the surface, it should have been a definitive blow to the years of doubt. But there was a problem, one too large to ignore. The testing was unofficial, unsanctioned, and dangerously flawed. The technology used at the time was primitive compared to today's standards, capable only of identifying basic paternity markers, not the complex ancestral patterns that modern science can now reveal. Without a verified sample source and full transparency, the alleged results carried the weight of rumor rather than resolution. What was meant to be conclusive felt more like an illusion of truth, a stunt to quiet the noise rather than address the root of it. And for Princess Diana, it was more than just public chatter. Friends close to her recalled the emotional toll the endless rumors took on her. Behind the radiant smile and global fame was a woman tormented by doubt, not in her knowledge, but in the relentless need to defend her child against a world eager to question his very identity. She was heartbroken, not because she feared the truth, but because of what the lies were doing to Harry. Richard Dalton, her trusted hairdresser, and Ken Worf, her former bodyguard, both stood firmly in her defense, reiterating the timeline again and again. Diana didn't meet James Hewitt until 2 years after Harry was born, yet their voices, no matter how clear, were drowned in the sea of scandal. And then came the silence. The royal family, true to form, refused to dignify the claims with a public response. Their silence was interpreted not as strength, but suspicion. The vacuum left by their unwillingness to engage only invited more speculation. With no official confirmation, the world filled in the blanks on its own. The whispers turned into headlines. The rumors evolved into belief. And Prince Harry, despite the so-called test, remained trapped in a story that wasn't his making. But Harry wasn't done. Years later, he'd go back, this time with the world's most advanced DNA tools. This time, the results couldn't be questioned. The answers were final. After years of being the subject of speculation, after carrying the weight of suspicion like a cloak he never asked to wear, Prince Harry made a decision that would forever silence the rumors. No more tabloids, no more half-truths, no more faceless whispers trailing his every move. He turned to something no opinion could distort: science, not the crude attempts of the early 2000s, but modern genetic testing, the kind that didn't just scratch the surface but dug deep into ancestral threads, unraveling lineages with brutal precision. The kind that could either prove everything the world thought it knew or dismantle it entirely. This wasn't about curiosity, it was about closure. For decades, Harry had been dissected by the media, his every feature compared, his every habit measured. His red hair, his demeanor, and his love for polo, all lined up like puzzle pieces that supposedly didn't fit. But Harry wasn't chasing a headline. He was chasing peace. With the most advanced DNA testing available, he sought to uncover not just paternity, but also clarity of deep genetic markers, inherited traits, and ancestral history. What came back was not a shock. It was a truth long whispered by his mother and defended by those who truly knew her. Charles, the man the world had doubted was indeed his biological father. The results were definitive. No maybes, no ambiguous percentages, no room for interpretation. The very blood that flowed through Harry's veins carried the Windsor legacy. But alongside that, just as clearly, was the flame of the Spencer line. The red hair, once a symbol of suspicion, was now evidence of inheritance passed down through Diana's family, not borrowed from an outsider. The resemblance to James Hewitt, so often exaggerated and weaponized, was finally exposed for what it truly was: coincidence. An unfortunate resemblance, yes, but nothing more. And yet, in that moment of truth, Harry didn't celebrate. He didn't shout from the rooftops. What he felt wasn't triumph. It was something far more complicated. Relief, certainly, but also sorrow. Because the truth, while freeing, didn't erase the years lost to speculation. It didn't undo the emotional bruises, the awkward silences, the strained family dinners, or the inner torment that came with never quite feeling like he belonged. The results may have validated what he had always suspected deep down, but they also reminded him of how far he'd drifted just to find the truth that had always been there. The world, of course, took notice. Headlines blared. Royal watchers tried to pivot. The narrative began to shift, but for Harry, the storm hadn't cleared, it had simply changed direction. The truth was out. But it didn't erase the cost of chasing it. He had proven he belonged, but in the process, he realized that knowing where you come from isn't the same as knowing where you're meant to stay. Because blood, while powerful, doesn't always bring peace. And just when it seemed like that peace might finally take root, Harry made a move no one expected. He had the answers, but that didn't mean he belonged. The DNA results were clear, unshakable, undeniable. He was Charles's son, a legitimate Windsor by blood. But as Prince Harry stared at the confirmation he had chased for so long, what washed over him wasn't acceptance, it was clarity. The truth hadn't stitched him back into the family fabric. It had only made one thing undeniable. He had never truly been part of it. Not in the way that mattered. Because family, real family, doesn't force you to prove yourself. It doesn't make you feel like an outsider for decades. And it certainly doesn't stay silent while your wife crumbles under the weight of a system that was built to break people like her. With the test results behind him, Harry could have stopped, could have resumed the charade, shaken hands at galas, bowed before the cameras and smiled through the same hollow rituals he'd endured his entire life. But he didn't. Because truth without action is just another prison, and Harry had spent too long living inside one. So he made a decision that would change everything. He walked away, not quietly, not diplomatically. He cut ties with the institution, with the expectations, with the illusion. In interviews, public appearances, and in his own words, he made it clear, bloodline doesn't make a family. Love does. Loyalty does. And in the palace where he was raised, those things were in short supply. At the center of it all was Meghan, the woman he loved, the woman the institution never accepted, an American actress, a divorcee, a woman of color, and for the royal family, that trifecta was unforgivable. What began as subtle rejection quickly grew into relentless scrutiny. The press painted her as everything she wasn't. The palace stayed silent, and behind closed doors, Meghan suffered. She tried to carry the crown's expectations, to mold herself into the perfect duchess. But the weight of centuries-old prejudice is too heavy for one woman to carry alone. She broke, quietly, privately, until she couldn't anymore. She admitted she wanted to disappear, to leave everything behind, even life itself. And that was the final blow for Harry, the line that could never be uncrossed. So he chose, not tradition, no title, not the cold comfort of legacy. He chose love, he chose Meghan, he chose freedom. America wasn't just a relocation, it was a rebirth. A place where his children wouldn't have to grow up questioning their worth. A place where he could finally breathe without the iron grip of royal protocol. It wasn't an escape, it was a revolution. His quiet rebellion against a system that had chewed up generations and spat them out in perfectly polished smiles. He didn't need a palace to feel whole. He needed peace. And he found it not in England's echoing halls, but in a modest home surrounded by the family he built, not the one he was born into. But the question lingered, why had he always felt so different, so disconnected? The royal family has always had shadows, and Harry was born into one. From the moment he took his first breath, he entered a world carefully crafted by centuries of secrets, buried scandals, and untold truths. The crown didn't just pass down titles and jewels, it passed down silence. It passed down survival through discretion, and in that silence lived ghosts. Affairs that were never named, betrayals that were never spoken. Pain was dressed in silk and paraded through marble halls. Harry didn't realize it at first. As a child, he was simply told who he was, where he belonged, and what he must never question. But over time, the stories that weren't told spoke louder than the ones that were. He started to look deeper, to read between the lines of royal history that had always been fed to him as fact. And what he found was something far from noble. His great-great-grandfather, King Edward VII, had lived a double life celebrated for his diplomacy, yet infamous behind the scenes for his countless mistresses and indiscretions. King George V, too, had whispered rumors trailing him questions about children born in silence, loyalties hidden behind palace walls. For generations, the monarchy had painted itself as the picture of moral clarity. But beneath the surface was a legacy of manipulation, affairs, and carefully covered chaos. The more Harry learned, the more he began to see a pattern not of evil, but of preservation. A desperate, calculated effort to maintain the illusion, no matter who had to suffer, to protect it. In the quiet of his study, far from the cameras and the crown, Harry stumbled across something that shook him more than any scandal from a century ago. A package. Anonymous. No sender. Inside it, brittle yellowed newspaper clippings. Scandals that spanned generations. Each one is connected by a theme of concealment, of shame wrapped in power, and among them, a single handwritten note that made his blood run cold. The truth exists, Prince Harry. The question is, are you ready to face it? It wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation and a test. One that forced him to ask the question he had been running from his whole life. Was he just another pawn in this generational game? The emotional toll hit him like a wave. Everything he'd endured, his mother's suffering, the endless scrutiny, the internal war between duty and identity wasn't just personal. It was systemic, baked into the very foundation of the monarchy. He wasn't just the outlier. He was the latest victim of a legacy that prized image over connection. A system that would rather bury the truth than face the discomfort of change. And once he saw it for what it was, there was no going back. Because Harry knew he had two choices: inherit the silence or shatter it. And so, he did what no Windsor had dared. He broke the cycle. He was the spare. Now he's just Harry. And that's enough. For years, his identity had been shaped by what? He wasn't the heir. He wasn't the traditional royal. He wasn't the obedient one. He was the spare, the backup, the second-born shadow of a future king. But that label, once worn like a silent sentence, no longer holds power over him. Because now Harry lives not for tradition but for truth. Not in palaces, but in peace. In a home built with intention, not inherited obligation. In California, surrounded by the family he chose, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet, he's found what years of royal service never gave him. A sense of belonging that doesn't require performance. And even in his freedom, he carries the legacy of those who shaped him. His daughter's name, Lilibet Diana, is more than a tribute. It's a bridge. A nod to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the matriarch who once defined the monarchy's unwavering stillness, and to his mother, Diana, who dared to disrupt it. Through that name, he honors the past without being chained to it. It's not about forgetting where he came from, it's about redefining what it means to move forward. Because Harry isn't trying to erase his royal blood. He's simply refusing to let it dictate his future. He has shed the titles, the protocol, the need to meet expectations he never believed in. No longer a working royal, no longer the controlled, curated version of himself, Harry stands fully, visible for the first time, not as a prince bound to legacy, but as a man choosing his legacy. In doing so, he has become something the monarchy was never prepared for, a symbol of departure, of healing, of change. He didn't burn the palace down, he simply walked out of it. And in that quiet defiance, he broke a cycle that held generations. Captive to duty, silence, and survival. There is power in that choice. Not the kind bestowed by crowns or titles, but the kind earned through courage, through honesty, through the relentless pursuit of something real. In Harry's voice now is the clarity of a man who has made peace with not being what the world demanded. Who has traded approval for authenticity. He may be royal by blood, but he is free by choice. And that, above all, is the truth the monarchy never saw coming. Prince Harry's story isn't just about DNA, it's about choosing who you are when the world insists you be someone else. What you think, share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.